So tonight's talk will be about, well, it's the first talk of the retreat, and in essence it will be about talking about what the retreat space is about. And I'll also be introducing the Four Truths, Four Noble Truths and Ennobling Truths, as they're sometimes called. And from that, giving some clarity about the Eightfold Path, and then segueing into meditation. But we'll do more clarity about meditation tomorrow. So, for many of you, well, some of you at least, it's your first retreat. And others have been very experienced with coming on retreats. And I remember my first retreat was about 43 years ago, and I was 19, so I'm 62 now. So I was 19, and I remember going on this retreat, and it was really weird. It was very strange. This was in the mid-70s, and it was hard. I was doing it was a Tibetan Buddhist retreat, so we were visualising Guru Shakyamuni and Avalokitesvara and the various deities, and having a lot of discussion about things. And it was in silence. And I found that my mind was a bit crazy. It seemed to me that retreats were like emphasising showing up things, showing up what was there already, and it was hard. I got a lot of pain, and my mind was painful as well. It's like it was constantly chattering and commenting and raving on about certain things. But it did actually kind of slowly quieten down a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And I remember at the age of 19, I was thinking, oh yeah, I know what's going on here. I can see this. I'll give me a year and I'll have it down pat. I'll get enlightened. Give me a year, I'll get enlightened. And I think I was a little bit naive. But I did realise some things. I realised that by opening up to my difficulty, I could ironically find freedom within the difficulty, which was a really interesting perspective. So I did that retreat, and then I went on to do other retreats. And I eventually went, I got involved in a whole range of spiritual endeavours, like I was living in Melbourne, I was an art student in Melbourne. It was like a spiritual supermarket at that time. I don't know if anybody, I don't know where you were, Anthony, in Melbourne, and I don't know where you were in the mid-1970s. But there was a lot of things going on. I was involved with a Christian healing church, and we used to do hands-on healing, and there was actually a lot of working with the chakras. Actually, it was quite interesting. And I was going to Lokananda I think it was on Saturday night, and Divine Light was on Friday night. And I was living at a place called Tara House, and so we do sadhanas and we do all these mantra practices. Wow, there was so much stuff going on. And I was getting a little bit confused. And eventually I went to a talk by someone called a bhikkhu, an English-born Theravadan Buddhist monk called Prakantipalo. And it was really, really good. It was really simple. He was just talking about waking up and practicing mindfulness. And I asked him the question, I said, well, what should you do? And he said, well, just get to know your own body and mind, and everything else will work out. And I thought that was really, really good advice. I was trying to work things out, all these different ideas about spirituality and so on. And I really love Tibetan Buddhism. And I've come back to Tibetan Buddhism in the last 10 years with a few practices. when I was 19, however, it was really, really complicated. You know, it was just so much stuff going on, I couldn't quite work it out. I don't know if anybody's practiced in Tibetan Buddhism. But anyway, so my Prakandipala was just talked about having a simple practice, like just getting to know yourself, being present with yourself, being mindful, and noticing what's going on. And it would help things. So I asked him, well, what should I do? You know, what's a good way of doing this? You know, how can you do this a lot? And he said, you could ordain as a Buddhist monk. I said, oh, that sounds really good. So that's what I did. I then kind of hung out with him for about another 8 or 9 months or something. I finished it was a diploma in art. It was creative film and photography, actually. I made a movie, made a film, I got a film grant and so on. I finished all that. And then I saved up some money and someone gave me some money and I went to Thailand and I became a monk. And I'd had a lot of retreats before then as well. Like I was hanging out with Prakandipala, being his, what's called a luksit, which is like his attendant. And I was listening to all his talks, and he would often talk about, he would often give a lesson on the suttas. The suttas are the discourses of the Buddha, and so also some major disciples, foremost disciples, and also Ananda. Anyway, these suttas, discourses of the Buddha, he would give us a sutta and then we'd have a discussion about it, and it would be like the sutta was really clear about certain principles in the practice. So I really appreciated him talking about the suttas. So anyway, I'd done a lot of retreats. And then I went on one retreat with him. It was a 10-day retreat. And then I stayed on. And the place I did this retreat was in Sydney. It was close to the Lane Cove River, the Lane Cove National Park. It was close to there. And it was in a house of a woman called Mari Biles. Mari Biles was the first female solicitor in New South Wales, I think. She was a really interesting woman, and she was Buddhist. And she let me stay in her house. She had she had the house, and then she had this little cave at the back of the house, and she had this other room about as big as this where people would do retreats in. But I stayed in this cave, and it had a little place where I could cook and so on. And I was just there by myself. I think I must have been 20 by then. And she came up and asked me, so what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm going to go to Thailand. I want to get enlightened. She said, well, what do you want to do? Why do you want to go to Thailand? I said, I want to find a really good teacher. I want to find a really, really good teacher, because then I can practice and I want to get enlightened. I've had it. I want to get off this cycle. I want to feel better. Look, by the way, I had a difficult adolescence. I had some things happen in my adolescence which were, well, I'll tell you up front, quite a bit of violence, a lot of alcohol. Not with me. I was getting drunk a little bit, but my father had left home. And my father had died, and then my mother had various boyfriends, and there was a bit of difficulty. I think I had a troubled adolescence. So I didn't want to hang around and have a family. I didn't want to do all sorts of things that people normally did. I wanted to get out of it. I really wanted to go to Thailand, and I thought I really wanted to get off this cycle of suffering. I wanted to wake up. So anyway, she's asking me, she said, well, why do you want to go to Thailand? I said, I want to find a good teacher. I want him to show me how to meditate and how to wake up. I want to become a monk. And she said, you know, you don't find a teacher, the teacher finds you. I said, no, yeah. And she says, you know what the teacher is? The teacher is suffering. The teacher is suffering. And I thought, wow, okay. I didn't really kind of believe her. I thought, no, I've really got to find a really good teacher. So I ended up going to Thailand, and it was quite difficult. And I went to a few places, and I'd go to one teacher and they'd end up kicking me out of their monastery, and I'd go to another teacher and it wasn't quite right. And I eventually found a teacher that was Achan Ben, who was, I looked at him like he was the Buddha, actually. He was quite amazing. When he'd walk, he'd be walking like a Rolls Royce of a person. It was just so amazing. And he was quite, confrontative. In Thai, the term is du, which means stern. He would du. He wouldn't hold back. He would tell you straight, and he would be quite harsh with you. So I went to Thailand. I was in this monastery, and I was trying to meditate. And I was quite skinny, very skinny actually, living off sticky rice, 1 meal a day. We'd usually go down to Pindapat very early in the morning and come back and get food put in bowls from the villagers. Come back, and there was this lump of rice that we'd kind of put into a ball, and it used to be about a fistful of glutinous sticky rice. I don't know if anybody's ever eaten glutinous rice. It's really hard to digest. And you'd get some chili powder, and you get a lot of food. People used to bring enormous amounts of food, horrendous amounts of food. But then I got really sick. I couldn't work out what was going on. So they got the doctor in, and it turned out that I had got malaria from down south when I was visiting down south, living in a forest down there in a monastery. So it was really difficult, and I thought I was going to die. And harsh is the right word, I think. Harsh. I couldn't really sit and meditate, or I thought I couldn't meditate. When I'd sit to do mindfulness of breath, which I was trying to do then, it was like I was so skinny, when my heart was beating, my body was kind of rocking in tempo to my heart. And if I actually focused on the movements of my body, that was more calming than if I focused on my breath. In fact, if I focused on my breath, I'd find it get really agitated. So that was really hard. And then there was a few other things. Later on, I got over that eventually, because I knew how to work with malaria. I'd had malaria once before from Portuguese Timor. It was then Portuguese Timor. I went and stayed in Portuguese Timor for a couple of months when I was 18, and I managed to pick up malaria, and I worked out how to deal with it, how to use the medication to get over it. And so I did that, and I kept staying in this monastery, and it was very hot, very difficult. We didn't have cushions, we'd just sit on the floor with a mat, like tile floors. And there wasn't any other English-speaking people in the monastery. I had to learn Thai, and slowly got more understanding of what Achan was saying, and then I got hepatitis, which was another ridiculous thing that was happening. And I eventually, I went a bit crazy with the hepatitis actually. I think there's some toxins happen with the liver, and it went into my brain, and it was kind of a nice crazy. But eventually I disrobed and I came back to Australia. So when I look back at that period, it was a couple of years. I had a physical teacher. It was Achan Ben. He was Achan Ben. But I also had another teacher, and that teacher was suffering. I mean, I wouldn't have had it any way different than that, because I learnt so much, and it sort of points to a principle that we find in the teachings. By the way, I've been back to see my teacher several times. Right now I don't know whether he's alive or not. He had a heart attack when I was there, and but when I went back 20 years, I've been back several times, and the most recent time I went back was, I think, 2010 or 2011, something like that. Met up with him. He was still as duk as ever. Duk means that sternness. And actually, when I went, the second last time I went to see him, I went with my current partner, and I went with a mobile phone, and had my sunglasses hanging off my belt, and I had a few other things, hat and a few other things hanging off me. And I walked up and I was saying, "Oh, hello teacher, hello Achan Ben," paying my respects. And he says, "Who's this? Who's this?" It's Kam, Bante. I used to be called Kam. Because it was an easy way of saying Malcolm. It was easier than saying, my real name was Mantagamo, but my Pali name was Mantagamo, but my name that they called me was Kam. And there was a way of pronouncing Kam. You can pronounce it in different ways, and if you say Tong Kam, if you say it like Kam, it means gold. So somebody nicknamed me as Gold. So I said, "It's Kam, Bante. I've come back to say hello and pay my respects." He says, "That's not Krum, it's Krum." And I said, "Krum?" He says, "Yes, you're Krum." And I couldn't work out what Krum was, but I looked it up a bit later, and Krum means attachment. So he said, "Here I am attached to all sorts of things." He says, "Look at all this. You've just got things hanging off. You've got mobile phones. He wouldn't have ever used a mobile phone. Anyway, so I'm coming back to this principle. This principle of the teacher being suffering, and also when we open up to suffering, that we can actually find freedom in it, because it's a principle that I noted on that first retreat, and it's also, I've seen it over and over and over and over again, even right up until now, and I'm now 62. To the extent that we can turn towards that which is difficult for us, to the extent that we can open up to it and see it for what it is, to be honest with it, to open up to it, to be present with it, and I want to use the word embrace, and I guess you could say that. To that extent, we can also be free from it. And this is the principle that we find in what's called the Four Truths. The Four Truths, which is what the Buddha taught. It's the essence of what the Buddha taught. The Four Truths are these: that there is dukkha, there is suffering. Well, maybe there is dukkha, and suffering is probably not the best way of translating that word dukkha. Dukkha is a Pali word. As far as I understand it, I'm not a Pali scholar, but I know a few Pali words. Dukkha, the du of dukkha means not right. The ka of dukkha means the space in the hub of a wheel. You know how you have a wheel and there's a space in that wheel? That's what cut refers to. So literally it means the space of the wheel is not right. And if you want to even go more literal, it means the wheel's not turning right. It's like an ill-fitting axle. An ill-fitting axle on a wheel. So things don't go quite right. So dukkha really means both gross suffering, but also subtle dissatisfaction or unsatisfactoriness. We used to chant, as a monk, we used to do a lot of chanting. I was never very good at remembering the chanting, but I could remember some bits of it. Some of those monks are fantastic at remembering the chanting. They've got excellent memory. They remember hours and hours of these. At the Patimokkha, for example, which is the Vinaya, which is the rules of the monk, it takes about 45 minutes to say that, and some monks would remember it all, you know, just the whole thing. Anyway, coming back to the gist of the story without going off on too many tangents. Dukkha, when we used to chant it, used to go something like this: Jati pi dukkha, jara pi dukkha, maranam pi dukkha, meaning the difficulties associated with birth, aging, sickness and death is dukkha. And I can't remember the rest of it, but it goes something like this: pain, grief, lamentation and despair is dukkha. And when they talk about pain, you're talking about emotional pain. You know, not just physical pain, it's mental torment and emotional difficulties. Not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, and being parted from that which is close to you or dear to you is dukkha. In fact, clinging to a separate sense of self, clinging to what we call five aggregates. We might talk about this later, but it's basically what we call ourselves. It's considered as 5 groups of experience. Form, which is tangible experience. Feelings, which refer to the hedonic nature of experience, like whether something's pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. Perceptions, or recognition, like I look over there and I see blanket, and I see person, man, Anthony. There's a recognition. That recognition, or that perception, is a quality of mind. I won't go into great details. The next component of what we call ourself is something called mental formations, which is when we have a perception, okay, camera, chair, person, then we have blah, 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 blah. That person is like that, blah, 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 blah. So I'm creating something. This is a mental component. This is another aspect of self. And the last aspect of self, or the fifth aspect of self, which is kind of like discussed as groups of things, is consciousness. Consciousness arises when we have contact with experience. Like, I'm conscious of that light that's turned off. I'm conscious of that fan. I'm conscious of sensations. I'm conscious of thoughts. I'm conscious of self. Consciousness is this knowing quality. So we have the self, and this isn't a talk about self at the moment, that's a whole talk in and of itself. But form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations and consciousness is what we call the self. Suffering is when we cling to that. Cling to it as solid, lasting, independent, in other words, not dependent on other things, as a solid, contracted thing. That's innately suffering, or innately dukkha. So the four truths are these: that there is dukkha. This is a reality. And I think if I ask you, do you have dukkha? I'm seeing a few nods. I do. I don't know about you guys. It's a lot less than it used to be, but I still have it. It's reality. Then there's the cause of dukkha. The second reality is that dukkha has an origin. There's causative factors for it coming together. And technically, in Buddhist psychology, the coming together of these experiences, the causes of these experiences, the cause of dukkha is the result of the bringing together of a whole range of different things, many that are completely beyond our control. Like, for example, our social upbringing, a genetic background, where we're born, and the climate, and the food we eat, and all the rest of it. All these things coming together in combination with the way we respond to those experiences coming our way. So if we respond with what's called greed, ignorance and hatred, then it's likely that dukkha will increase. If we respond to non-greed, non-ignorance, in other words wisdom, and non-hatred, in other words loving kindness and compassion and openness and equanimity and so on, then it's likely that the dukkha will decrease, if that makes sense. So in Buddhist psychology, they talk about the root causes of suffering being in our hearts, in our heart minds. Meaning that life will happen, we'll have experiences, and we will feed into them. And the way we feed into them either gives us more suffering or less, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So we have the first truth that there is suffering. Then we have the origins of suffering, or dukkha. Probably better that I use the word dukkha. The origins of dukkha. And then we have this other thing, freedom from dukkha. That's the third truth. The possibility to be free. Which is sometimes called nibbana in Pali, or nirvana in Sanskrit. And the last truth is that there is a way to be free. So these are two cause-effect relationships, basically. Suffering and its causes, freedom from suffering and its causes. And if we don't have the causes for suffering, if we don't have the causes for dukkha, then we don't experience dukkha. That's kind of logical, isn't it? That sort of not quite mathematical, but it's like there's a formula. No cause for suffering, no suffering. Is that right? When we have a cause for dukkha, there's dukkha. If there's no cause for dukkha, we don't have dukkha. So the freedom from dukkha is not having dukkha. So if we don't feed into experience with greed, ignorance and hatred, if we apprehend experience wisely, if we see we no longer grasp after things and cling on to pleasant experiences in an addictive way, and if we no longer reject things and push things away and avoid things and get aversive to experience, then we're no longer feeding into the dukkha. So we don't have the dukkha. Not having the dukkha is nibbana. That's the way of describing nibbana. In fact, again, I'm not an expert on the Sanskrit or Pali, but I've heard that one way they talk about nibbana is sort of negating something. It's one translation of it is being unbound, not bound. Nit, not bound, bhana. So not feeding into something. So nibbana is freedom, because we're not feeding into it. So what about the way to freedom? What about, how do you do this? Well, what the Buddha talked about was something called the Eightfold Path, which is right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. This is, in fact, right view, right intention is this wisdom component of the path. Right speech, right action, right livelihood is what's called the ethical component of the path. And the right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration is called the meditation component of the path. I'm using the term right here as a translation of the Pali term samma. Samma is also called, another way that you can describe samma is as balanced, is as skillful, is as correct, is as appropriate. I know that sometimes people get a bit funny when you say the word right, as if you're being judgmental about it. But it's like, we came up from Adelaide today, and we're at pains to make sure we were going in the right direction, weren't we? I even bought my GPS from the East Coast. And so there was a right direction. If we would have headed south when we got out of the airport, which we did do initially, but if we continued to head south, then we'd be going in the wrong direction. So when we have these terms right in front of these, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, it means that it's most suitable for us to be free from dukkha. It's leading to nibbana, or leading to freedom. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about meditation in a while, but coming back to that original principle that I was talking about, which is turning into the suffering, or coming face to face with the suffering, getting to see it and understand it and not run away from it. It has a powerful effect. And in the first sutta that the Buddha gave, the first official sutta, yes, the first sutta, it's called The Turning of the Wheel of Dhamma. He gave it near Varanasi and Patna to the 5 ascetics. These 5 ascetics were hanging out with him while he was being an ascetic, and they really admired him because he was, doing all these really amazingly difficult practices for 6 years after he left his home life. But then when the Buddha decided to follow the middle way and had some soup and had some rice meal and put on some weight and sat under the Bodhi tree and became enlightened, when he initially decided to let go of the being really like harmful with himself, like really a strong path of asceticism, they thought he'd gone the slack path. They didn't want to know about him, so they left, and they were doing something else away from him. But the Buddha realised that these 5 ascetics would know what he was talking about, so he sought them out, and he came up close to them, and they first of all said, "Oh, there's Gautama. Let's not pay attention to him." But he came up. As he came closer, they couldn't help themselves. They saw how light and bright he was, so they made a chair for him and they sat him down, and he said, "Look, you guys, I've discovered the truth. I've discovered awakening." And they said, oh, no, you can't be true. And he said to them, have I ever lied to you? Have I ever told them this truth? Do you know me of being someone who doesn't tell the truth? And they said, no. So he told them 3 times. He invited them 3 times to listen to him. And they eventually listened to him. What he talked about was the 4 truths and the Eightfold Path and the cause of suffering. And basically he talked about these 4 truths as if they were tasks in a sequence. The first task is related to the first truth, which is dukkha. The task related to that is to understand it, to see it, to understand it, to lean into it, not in a kind of masochistic or a masochistic way, but to see it for what it is, to lean into it, to understand it. And then when you do that, you see the true causes of one's dukkha, which is tendencies inclined towards greed, which is grasping after pleasant experiences, a sort of addictive quality to pleasant experiences, grasping after, clinging on, and so on. Ignorance, which is misunderstanding, misapprehending, misperceiving, not seeing clearly, not knowing experience for what it is. And hatred. In other words, aversion, rejection, condemnation, pushing away, denial, and just not wanting to know about it. So, when we understand dukkha, we see this. Then we see the second truth, the second realization. We see clearly into it, and the task of the second realization is to let go of those patterns, to release them. Just like you pick up a hot potato, you're holding a hot potato, you automatically release it. It's like that. When you see clearly the causes of your suffering, or the causes of your dukkha, you stop doing it. When you turn towards it and understand it, you see the causes of it, then when you see clearly the causes of it, you have that realization, oh, these are the causes. It's my clinging, it's my grasping, it's my holding on to, it's my craving, it's my misunderstanding, it's my lack of wisdom, my lack of insight. The more you do that, the more you see, I'm causing myself great torment and unsatisfactoriness and dukkha. So you let it go. That's the task of the second truth. So when you let it go, what happens is you experience the third truth, which is nibbana. And in the beginning of this talk I mentioned noble truths and ennobling truths. Noble truths refer to having insight into this ultimate reality, I suppose. Having insight into the experiences of nibbana. Having insight into nibbana or freedom. Ennobling means not so much like a noble truth, but one is leading towards that, but not having experience into the absolute nature of that, if that makes sense. It's like when I do therapy with people, they're not waking up to absolute realities. They're not waking up to nibbana or anything like that. But they will often wake up to relative ways of finding freedom within their suffering, if that makes sense. So I will often say they're having experiences of the ennobling truths, if that makes sense, to the extent that they can let go of destructive patterns and habits. To that extent, they can experience some freedom. Does that make sense to you guys? Or are you look really? what happens in talks is I usually get fired up and everyone else starts to fall asleep. Sometimes I wake up. Anyway, okay, so can you see the sequence here? That we have dukkha. If we turn towards it, we start to see the second truth. Then when we see the second truth and we realise it, like letting go of a hot potato, we no longer feed into our suffering or feed into our dukkha. Then we experience freedom, even if it's relative freedom. And then once we experience freedom, we want to live that path. We want to live that way. So the task of the third truth, Nibbana, is to realise it, to fully acknowledge it, to notice it and say, wow, this is actually freedom. This is to recognise it, to see it. And when we do that, when we see that, we live that path. We no longer want to go back and feed into our suffering anymore. We say, okay, I'm living this path. And the path is one of wisdom, kind of ethics, which is non-harmful. You're no longer feeding into things with ethical behaviour and meditation. So when I'm talking about this sequence, it's what I realised in my first retreat, and I continue to realise as I'm getting older and older, that when we can turn towards the difficult things, when we can open up to it, and it's ongoing, by the way. It doesn't sort of stop, after you'd had malaria and you're 20 years old, and well, I was 23 when I had malaria. No, 22 when I had malaria. Sorry. You don't process and then you wake up forever. It's like an ongoing process. It's like a constant process of waking up. So this is what happens in retreats. Often on retreats, we might find it difficult. Sometimes we might find it blissful. And I've had blissful retreats in my later years, but when I first started retreating, it was so difficult. It was like unbearable. So if you start to have some difficulty in your retreat, think of it, wow, this is an opportunity for freedom and liberation. Rejoice in it, because if you can understand it, you can be free, if that makes sense. There was a point I was going to make. Yeah, I wanted to kind of bring it home. How we were talking about maybe not having this retreat. I think earlier in the week, Monique emailed me. I think it was Tuesday. Was it Tuesday? Yeah, it was Tuesday. Or was it Wednesday? Maybe it was Wednesday. Monique emailed me saying, Malcolm, I don't know what to do. My mother's really ill. And she might die any moment. What should we do? And I said, we've got three options. We can call off the retreat. I can just go on the retreat. You stay home and get someone else. You just get me to the retreat, or you can come to the retreat, and we can just play it by ear. So we decided to go with the third one. But the very fact that someone's dying. I mean, I've had my brothers died, and my mother and father have both died. And I had a friend die in my house a couple of months ago. He was living I've got a unit under my house. He died. Dying is difficult. Not only for the person, but for everyone. It's just this difficulty. It's a bummer. Dukkha is like a bummer. But it's more than a bummer. It's like this person's life is going, and it's really difficult for Monique as well. When my brother was dying, and various people around me have died, it's difficult. People get upset. We get upset. We're losing something. It's really, really hard. And aging is difficult. Sickness is difficult. I exercise every day. I'm a pretty healthy person. I used to think I was a pretty healthy person. I exercise every day. Pretty conscious of my food that I eat. And, I've done I ride a bicycle every day. I've ridden a bicycle every day except when I come on retreats. I don't have a bicycle. But every day for about 35 years, I've ridden a bicycle to work every day that I've worked. And I have some genetic history though. My mother had a heart attack. My father died of a heart attack at the age of 58. My brother had a heart attack when he was 48. My uncle had a heart attack when he was 40 and died. My sister's got stents. And I've been really conscious about living a healthy life. I'm dairy-free, etc., etc. And then I started to get chest pain about in November. So I went to my GP and he sent me to get a cardiac perfusion test, and it was all clear. I'd had a few of them before. But he said there was a strange beat. So he sent me to the cardiologist, and the cardiologist looked at me and said, go and get an angiogram. So I had an angiogram on the 29th of January, and they wanted me to take benzodiazepine so I could be relaxed, and I said, no, I want to see what's going on. So I didn't want to take any benzos. So I was watching what was going on, and I could see the blood going through. An angiogram is where they inject you with a kind of dye that gets picked up through the X-ray machines, and then they film it. And I've got the recording of it. And you see, and the doctor's pointing out, you see that? There's a completely blocked artery. And you see that? There's some stenosis. Stenosis means blockages. Looks like it's about 60 to 70% blockages. And so I'm looking at this and I'm going, oh wow, this is just the way it is. This is the way it is, This is my genetic inheritance. This is the way it is, I'm most likely going to die of a heart attack. Or maybe I'll die of something else. And it's imminent. I mean, I could have a heart attack any moment. Because look at this. You can see the right coronary artery is completely blocked. But my heart has done something else. I mean, it's done these little it's compensated by creating little bypasses from my left coronary artery. So it's kind of interesting. But the fact is, we grow old, we die. We don't know when we're going to die. And it's a bit of a bummer. I've got 2 grandchildren now. I'd like to see them grow up. But, I'm going to die one day. We're going to be parted. So, the more we can kind of tune into that, the more we can turn towards it, the more we can come to terms with the reality of that dukkha, the more it is possible to be free. And what I mean by freedom here is peace. Like I don't want to struggle with this. And I'm sure Monique doesn't want to struggle with her mother's dying. It's going to be painful. I'm going to die who knows when. I had a bit of a heart thing that had a bit of chest pain in the airport when I picked up my heavy bag. I picked up and I went, well, that's interesting. I'll wait to see how long that goes for. Bit of a bummer. I'm just about to get on a plane. I hope I don't have a heart attack right now. And I waited around and it just disappeared. And the rule of thumb is if it lasts for about more than 5 or 10 minutes, then you've got to call somebody. So I kind of watch it. So it's going. It's okay. It's going. So we come on a retreat. We come on a retreat and we practice being present with experience. And I'll talk about mindfulness tomorrow. Mindfulness is key. And we also practice calming and stilling our hearts, quietening down our minds, becoming really peaceful and still. And that in combination, the combination of seeing things as they are, with a still heart, with a peaceful heart, with a clear mind, produces wisdom. And with wisdom, we can make helpful motivations or create helpful intentions that will lead towards well-being and happiness and peace, and not sort of feed into our habitual patterns that may cause suffering. And then when we make good intentions, we live a life with our speech, with our actions and our livelihood that is in accordance with our best understanding and our good intentions. And when we do that, we have a kind of a mental composure so that we then have courageous effort. Courageous is the term, by the way, for the term effort. Often it's called courage, because it's hard. We have to be courageous to look into what's happening in our lives, to turn towards that which is difficult, or even understand the things that are going well. It takes a lot of courage to stop and look and see and be honest with. And then when we have that courage, we're able to apply mindfulness, which, just as a quickie, the way I understand mindfulness is remembering to be attentive to immediate experience with care and discernment. That's one way I would describe it, which is the way Bhikkhu Bodhi describes it. Or just remembering to be attentive, rather than forgetting to be attentive. Remembering to be attentive. When we remember to be attentive, and we combine that with a really focused attention, where we bring our attention together and we let it settle and stabilise, become very peaceful and clear, then wisdom arises. So you see this as a cycle? In Buddhism it's called the Dharma wheel. That first discourse that the Buddha gave to the five ascetics was the turning of the wheel of Dhamma. And this Eightfold Path is often depicted as a wheel, in that it turns, and the more it turns, the more it gains momentum. The stronger it gets, the more liberating it becomes. So, I'm going to finish this talk. Two things. I'll finish this talk with an analogy that I often use about meditation. And also just a brief mention of the hindrances. Actually, maybe I'll mention the quick hindrances quickly tonight, and then I'll go into more detail perhaps tomorrow. So the analogy that I want to use, that I've used many times, and I thought it was mine, but it wasn't. I think I've noticed Pema Chodron uses it as well, and I think Ajahn Chah uses something similar. It's like a mind is like a muddy pond. A muddy pond, and I used this on that retreat that you came to. And it's like we come along to the pond and we lean over and we lose some precious jewels in the pond. And we can't see where the precious jewels are because we can't see through the mud. All the silt and sediments all stirred up. So we think about what to do, and what we can do is we let the sediment settle. We can't see it, we don't want to look around because you don't know what's in the pond. So we just let the sediment settle, and we put up protection around the pond, so things don't drop into it, protects from the weather and all the rest of it, so that the water doesn't get stirred up, and people don't jump into the pond, stir it up even more. We let all the sediments settle, and the water get very, very clear, and it gets clearer and clearer, and the sediment settles, and eventually we can see inside the pond. And it's all visible. Everything's really clear. And as we look around, we still can't see the precious jewels, but we notice some broken bottles and rusty cans, and bits of pipes and nails and timber with things sticking out. And we say, "Wow, lucky I didn't hop in that pond, and lucky I got protected the pond from the kids jumping in because they could have hurt themselves." We can mindfully take those broken bottles and rusty cans and dangerous objects out of harm's way. Or at least, if we can't get them out of harm's way, we know where they are. But we're still looking around. We still can't find our precious jewels. And then we use some inquiry and investigation. We look underneath some rocks, and then we find our precious jewel. And we bring it back, and it's ours again. And we feel happy. So, it's all a metaphor or analogy. The protecting of the pond so that it doesn't get stirred up is analogous to maintaining or keeping what we call moral precepts. Those 5 precepts that I spoke about earlier today. That protects our lives. When we're no longer stirring up our lives, we're able to at least let our minds settle a bit. We can get some clarity in our mind. Some people, I see so many people that really, they're living crazy lives. They act so like they're mad. They just feed into their suffering so badly. They live unethical lives that are harming themselves or others. Anyway, that protection is helping that settle down. The settling down of the sediment is what we call, what I'd be analogous to serenity meditation, which I'll talk about tomorrow. But it's the clarity of mind. It's like letting the sediment settle. It's focusing our attention, bringing our attention down into one spot, and letting our minds become really clear, letting things settle down. The looking and the inquiry is analogous to insight, which is very strongly driven by mindfulness, like inquiry into things, questioning what's going on here, and looking and seeing. The rusty cans and the broken bottles and the bits of timber and crap that you might see is analogous to what we start to see in our consciousness when the mud settles down, if that makes sense. Which is something we need to be careful of, we need to be aware of, that when you stop, when you do sit still, we see stuff that we may not want to see. Which is often the reason why we're so kind of frantically busy all the time, because we're just avoiding that. So that's another analogy. And the putting the precious jewels back on, reclaiming them, is reclaiming our compassionate wisdom. So I like that analogy. I've gone over time a little bit. I'm going to mention the hindrances very quickly, and I'll go into more detail. The hindrances, there's 5 hindrances. The first hindrance is obsessive desire, obsessive wanting, like the mind constantly going at wanting something. Could be, it's usually called sensual desire, but could include ideas, and like sometimes I want to write books or something like that, and I'll be thinking about what I'm going to say. That becomes a hindrance. It's kind of pulling me out of being present. But it could also include, just sitting there thinking about what you're going to do after the retreat finishes, and have a hot bath, or go and get some nice, go to a nice restaurant or something like that. Obsessive desire. You get fixated on it, obsessive with it. The next one is ill will, and it is this kind of aversion. Everything's not quite right. It's too noisy, or it's too many cars, or the food's not right, my body's not quite comfortable, the chair's not right, etc., etc., etc. Pushing away. It becomes a hindrance. The third hindrance is that the third or the fourth? A restlessness. No, the third one, sorry. The third one is, I'll get them in the right order. It's called sloth and torpor, but probably a better way to describe it is mental thickness and dullness. It's kind of like, you can't see anything. It's like, often manifests as going off to sleep. Not to judge the need to sleep, by the way, because you'll probably feel like you want to sleep most of tomorrow. Often when people begin retreats, it's like we're so sleep deprived that we just want to sleep. That when we stop, we just want to sleep all the time. But it's this thickness and dullness, not necessarily being sleep deprived, but it's from when it's sort of like a resistance to seeing into things, so we just get thick. It's a hindrance. The fourth hindrance is restlessness and agitation and worry in your minds. It's sort of energetically opposite to this mental thickness. It's kind of like you're so agitated and restless and your mind just doesn't settle. And the fifth hindrance is called paralysing doubt, or chronic procrastination. It's where you sort of not really sure about something, so you don't do anything. You open your eyes and you look around and you say, "Why are these people sitting, being mindful of their breath for? It's useless. How's that going to be freeing? Much better to go out and do something productive. Sitting around doing nothing. Better to go out and make some money or something like that." It's that doubt. It's the procrastinating. It's like you're coming at a fork of a road. This is an analogy. Fork of a road, and you don't know which way to go, so you don't go anywhere. You're stuck. I'm just giving you these because these are what happens with meditation, and they're around for a long time. When you overcome them, you're enlightened. So get familiar with them. Get to know them, and there's little strategies for each and every one of them. However, probably the best strategy is to know it, to name it, and say, I see you. It's just restlessness and worry. Oh, it's just sloth and torpor, or mental thickness and dullness, or it's just ill will. Seeing it for what it is, and it doesn't take over. It becomes manageable. Okay, I think I've talked enough. Thank you very much. Maybe let's just sit quietly for a couple of minutes, and if you want to ask any questions, we can do that.